Imagine you're standing on the docks of Acapulco sometime around 1593. The morning sun is climbing over the mountains behind the city, but it can't quite reach the harbor yet, because something is blocking it, something enormous. A shadow stretches across the entire wharf, swallowing the fishing boats, the warehouses, the small chapel near the water. You look up, and for a moment your brain refuses to accept the scale of what you're seeing. It's a ship, but calling it a ship feels wrong. It's a wooden mountain. 3 towering masts rise so high their tops disappear into the morning mist. The hull is painted in deep reds and golds, with carved saints and angels staring down from the stern. The decks rise in tiers, layer upon layer, like a floating palace stacked on top of a floating fortress stacked on top of a floating warehouse. The smell of fresh tar, gunpowder, sandalwood, and gold dust hangs in the air. Now zoom out. Pull the camera high above Acapulco, then higher still until you can see the whole Pacific Ocean stretched below you. A blue desert 9,000 miles wide. There are no charts for most of it, no safe harbors, no rescue ships, just water, wind, scurvy, and storms big enough to swallow whole fleets. And in the middle of that emptiness, one route. A single curving line that arcs from Acapulco northwest toward Japan, then bends south through typhoon country, all the way to Manila in the Philippines. The longest regular ocean voyage in human history. 6 months out, 6 months back. Year after year for 2.5 centuries. The cargo holds are sealed with iron locks and royal stamps. Inside, the wealth of 2 continents waits to be moved. Mexican silver bars heavier than a grown man can lift. Chinese silk bolts wrapped in oiled paper, porcelain from Jingdezhen, spices from the Moluccas, pearls from the Sulu Sea, lacquered chests from Japan, cinnamon, cloves, ivory. A king's ransom doesn't begin to describe it. This was a continent's ransom. Now think about who else knew that ship was coming. English privateers waiting off the California coast, Dutch raiders prowling the Indonesian straits, pirates camped in the Marianas, rival kingdoms in Asia watching every Spanish flag with hunger, storms that had killed dozens of these vessels before, reefs that no chart had ever marked. Every single one of them dreamed of the same thing. Just one of these ships taken, one successful boarding, one lucky storm pushing her aground on a coast where she could be salvaged. The wealth aboard a single one of these vessels could buy a country. That ship was a galleon. And for 250 years, she was the most coveted prize on the surface of the planet. Part 2. This is the story of the ship that built empires. The story of a wooden fortress so wealthy, so heavily defended, and so symbolically powerful that the act of capturing just one could shift the balance of power between nations. The galleon didn't just sail through the age of empires. She built them. Every cathedral in Seville, every palace in Madrid, every silver mine in Bolivia, every Catholic mission from California to the Philippines was financed, in one way or another, by what these ships carried. More wealth crossed the oceans aboard galleons than any other vessel type in human history. Estimates suggest that between 1565 and 1815, over 3 billion pesos in silver alone made the journey from the Americas to Spain. That's before you count the gold, the gems, the silk, the spices, the porcelain. The numbers are so large they stop feeling real. And here's the part that gets overlooked. Every pirate you've ever heard of, from Francis Drake to Henry Morgan to Bartholomew Roberts, would have given everything they owned for one good shot at a fully loaded galleon. The smaller, faster ships of the Caribbean, the brigantines, the sloops, the schooners, those were the tools. The galleon was the dream. Most of them died still dreaming. This is the story of the floating fortress that defined 2.5 centuries of global commerce. The ship that made Spain the richest empire in human history, and the ship whose magnificent slow decline ended an entire age of the world. Part 3. Before we go any further, we need to understand what a galleon actually was. Because, like with the sloop, Hollywood has done a number on the public imagination, and most people picture something that never really existed. A galleon in her classical form, roughly between 1570 and 1700, was a multi-decked sailing warship and cargo carrier built on a scale that defied her own era. The smallest galleons ran around 100 feet long and 500 tons. The largest, the famous Manila galleons of the 17th and 18th centuries, could stretch over 160 feet and displace 2,000 tons or more. For comparison, a typical pirate sloop weighed less than 100 tons. A galleon was 20 times the mass of the ship hunting her. She carried 3 masts, sometimes 4, with a complex mix of square sails on the fore and main masts, and a lateen sail on the mizzen for maneuverability. The bow swept up into a beak-like prow inherited from her Mediterranean ancestors. The stern rose into a multi-storied castle, sometimes 3 or 4 decks tall, ornately carved, painted, and gilded. Below that towering stern were the captain's quarters, the officers' mess, the chapel. Yes, the chapel. Galleons carried priests, said mass at sea, and considered their voyages religious enterprises as much as commercial ones. Below the chapel were the gun decks. A heavy galleon could carry 40, 50, sometimes 70 cannons arranged in tiered broadsides. Beneath the gun decks the cargo holds, vast, sealed, locked, and reinforced. The crew aboard a fully manned war galleon could number 400 men. Sailors, marines, officers, gunners, carpenters, surgeons, cooks, priests, and on the Manila run, sometimes hundreds of paying passengers including merchants, friars, soldiers, and colonial officials. She was slow. There's no use pretending otherwise. A galleon under full sail in good wind might make 6 or 7 knots. A sloop could outrun her at twice that speed. But the galleon wasn't built to chase or flee. She was built to dominate. She carried more guns than most coastal forts. She carried more soldiers than many garrisons. She was a fortress that happened to float. And in an era when crossing an ocean meant putting your life in the hands of whatever vessel carried you, she was the only ship in the world rich enough, strong enough, and stubborn enough to make the longest voyages on Earth, year after year, against everything the planet could throw at her. Part 4. To understand the galleon, you have to understand the 2 great maritime highways she ruled. The first was the Carrera de Indias, the Spanish treasure fleet route through the Caribbean. Twice a year, sometimes once, a convoy of galleons would gather in Seville, sail south to the Canary Islands, then cross the Atlantic to the New World. One branch went to Veracruz in Mexico. Another went to Cartagena and Portobelo on the Spanish Main. There, they loaded silver from the mines of Potosi, gold from New Granada, emeralds, hides, cocoa, and tobacco. Then the fleets converged in Havana before making the dangerous run home through the Florida Strait and across the Atlantic. This route was lucrative beyond reason. It was also lethal. The Caribbean is a hurricane factory. Whole fleets vanished in single storms. In 1715, an entire treasure fleet of 11 ships was destroyed off the Florida coast by a single hurricane. The wreckage is still being recovered today. The second highway was even longer and even more astonishing. The Manila galleon trade. Once a year, sometimes twice, a single enormous galleon would leave Acapulco loaded with Mexican silver and sail west across the Pacific to Manila. There, the silver was exchanged for Chinese silk, porcelain, spices, and luxury goods funneled into Manila from across Asia. Then, the same galleon, or her sister vessel, made the return journey east across the Pacific, riding the Kuroshio current up past Japan, looping across the North Pacific, and finally coming down the California coast to Acapulco. The eastbound trip from Manila to Acapulco took an average of 6 months. 6 months at sea. No resupply, no rescue. Scurvy could kill half the crew. Storms could dismast the ship. Calms could leave her motionless for weeks. And somewhere in the North Pacific, English privateers waited specifically for this one ship, because everyone in the world knew when she was coming. 2 highways, both ruled by galleons, both feeding the wealth of half the world into Spain's veins, and both haunted by hurricanes, typhoons, pirates, and rival empires that wanted nothing more than to break Spain's monopoly on that flow. This was the battlefield, and no ship but a galleon could survive on it. Part 5. Now let's talk about what life aboard a galleon actually looked like, because the romance fades quickly when you understand the reality. A Manila galleon voyage began with months of preparation. The loading manifest alone could take half a year to complete. Every chest, every bolt of silk, every silver bar had to be weighed, inventoried, sealed, and stamped by royal officials. Bribes flowed. Forged manifests appeared. Captains routinely smuggled extra cargo into hidden compartments because the official tax on goods was crushing. When the ship finally sailed, she carried not just sailors but a floating town. Marines, priests, merchants, soldiers, colonial officials, indentured workers, sometimes even royal envoys. The lower decks were packed so tightly that men slept in shifts, sharing the same hammocks. Sanitation was almost non-existent. Diseases like scurvy, typhus, and dysentery ran through the crowded decks like fire. The food was salted beef, hardtack biscuits, dried peas, and on lucky days, fish. Water spoiled within weeks and was usually drunk mixed with wine or vinegar to mask the taste. Toward the end of long voyages, sailors would chew on leather, eat rats, and pry weevils out of biscuits before swallowing the rest. Some Manila galleon voyages lost a third of their crew to disease before reaching port. And yet, when an attacker appeared on the horizon, this floating slum transformed into one of the most disciplined fighting platforms on the planet. Galleons did not flee. That was doctrine. A galleon ran from nothing because running was almost always futile. She was too slow, too heavy, too valuable to abandon her formation. Instead, she fought. The Marines aboard, often 100 or more professional soldiers, would form ranks on the upper decks. The gunners would open the gun ports and run out the cannons. The sailors would secure rigging and prepare boarding repellents. Boiling oil, hand grenades, swivel guns, and clusters of musketeers in the rigging. When a pirate sloop closed in on a galleon, the sloop's captain knew exactly what he was facing. A wall of cannon fire from 100 yards out. A storm of musket balls from above. And if any pirate actually managed to climb the towering hull and reach the deck, he'd find himself outnumbered by trained Spanish soldiers fighting from elevated positions. Most pirates who tried to take galleons died. The few who succeeded did so through extraordinary luck, extraordinary planning, or extraordinary betrayal from inside the galleon's own crew. Taking one was the dream, but the dream had teeth. Part 6. You can't tell the story of the galleon without the men who spent their lives trying to capture one. So let's meet them. The first great galleon hunter was Sir Francis Drake. In 1579, off the coast of what is now Ecuador, Drake's small ship Golden Hind ran down the Spanish galleon Nuestra Señora de la Concepción, nicknamed the Cacafugo. The Cacafugo was a treasure ship returning from Peru, loaded with silver, gold, and emeralds. Drake's gunners shot away her mizzen mast, his men boarded her, and the Spaniards surrendered after a brief fight. The haul was so enormous it took 6 days to transfer. Drake returned to England a national hero. Queen Elizabeth knighted him on the deck of his own ship. The capture humiliated Spain so deeply that Philip II reportedly put a personal bounty of 20,000 ducats on Drake's head. Then came Thomas Cavendish. In 1587, off the coast of Baja California, Cavendish ambushed the Manila galleon Santa Ana. The Santa Ana, somehow, was sailing without her usual cannons. She had been overloaded with cargo and had left her main guns behind in Manila to make room. Cavendish circled her for 6 hours, pouring musket and light cannon fire into her decks. The Santa Ana finally surrendered. Cavendish took 122,000 pesos in gold, silks, and porcelains, and burned the rest. He returned to England the second man in history to circumnavigate the globe, and the first to do it on purpose. 40 years later came the greatest single galleon capture in history. Piet Hein, a Dutch admiral and former galley slave, intercepted the entire Spanish treasure fleet at Matanzas Bay, Cuba in 1628. Not one ship, the entire fleet, 11 galleons and support vessels. The Spaniards, caught against the shoreline, ran their ships aground trying to escape. Hein captured the wrecks, the cargo, and the survivors. The haul was 11.5 million guilders, enough to fund the Dutch army for 8 months, and pay every shareholder of the Dutch West India Company a 50% dividend. To this day, Piet Hein is the only commander in history to capture an entire Spanish treasure fleet. Then there was Woodes Rogers. Yes, the same Woodes Rogers who later became governor of the Bahamas and ended the golden age of piracy. Before that, in 1709, Rogers was a privateer. Off the coast of California, he intercepted the Manila galleon Nuestra Señora de la Encarnación. The fight lasted hours. Rogers was wounded in the face. But he took the ship. The cargo paid for his entire expedition and made him famous across Europe. And finally, on the other side of the same equation, Captain Manuel López de Pinto, a galleon captain who, in 1743, faced the English Commodore George Anson off the Philippines. Anson had been chasing Manila galleons for over a year. When he finally caught one, the Nuestra Señora de Covadonga, López did exactly what galleon captains were trained to do. He fought. For 90 minutes, his crew exchanged broadsides with Anson's superior ship. López was wounded twice. His ship was eventually taken, but his defense became legendary. Anson himself wrote that the Spanish captain had behaved with the highest honor. These men, hunters and defenders alike, defined 2 centuries of global warfare, and every one of them measured his life's success by what he did or didn't do to a galleon. Part 7. So how does the galleon stack up against her rivals? Because she didn't exist in a vacuum. The sea was full of large ships in the 16th and 17th centuries. Some came before her. Some replaced her. None of them did exactly what she did. The Carrack was the galleon's mother, a late medieval Portuguese and Spanish design that dominated the 15th and early 16th centuries. Big, round, high-castled, slow, and not very stable. Carracks were the ships that carried Columbus and Vasco da Gama, but they were dangerous to sail. Their high stern castles made them top-heavy and prone to capsizing in storms. The galleon was essentially a refined, longer, lower, more stable evolution of the carrack. By 1600, galleons had almost completely replaced carracks. The now was the galleon's smaller cousin, a general-purpose Spanish merchant ship, lighter, less heavily armed, and used for shorter routes. Naos sailed in the treasure fleets too, but always under galleon escort. A now alone was a tempting target. A now under galleon protection was usually safe. The frigate in its mature form came later. Faster, sleeker, single-gun deck, designed for speed and patrol rather than line battle. Frigates were the ships that eventually replaced galleons in the warship role, particularly for the British and French navies in the 18th century. But a frigate couldn't carry what a galleon carried. She was a hunter, not a hauler. The ship of the line was the galleon's military successor. By the late 17th century, navies were building dedicated battleships with 2 or 3 gun decks and 70 to 100 cannons. These vessels were more firepower-dense and more maneuverable than galleons. But they were also pure warships. They carried no cargo. They were too expensive to risk on commerce. And then there was the East Indiaman, built primarily by the English, Dutch, and French East India Companies. These were huge armed merchant vessels designed to carry trade goods from Asia to Europe. In many ways, the East Indiaman was the galleon's commercial heir, but she was leaner, more specialized, and operated under a different logic. The Indiaman was about profit. The galleon was about empire. The point is this. The galleon stood alone for 2.5 centuries because nothing else combined her capabilities. She was a warship that carried cargo, a cargo ship that carried armies, a merchant vessel that flew the royal flag, a floating embassy, a traveling treasury, a church, a barracks, a fortress. There has never been another ship quite like her, and there probably never will be. Part 8. Let's talk about the things most people never learn about galleons. The hidden details that explain why these ships endured for so long, and why capturing them was even harder than it looked. Start with the wood. The Manila galleons, the most legendary of all, were built almost exclusively in Cavite, the great shipyard outside Manila in the Philippines. They were built from Philippine hardwoods, especially malave and luan. These woods were so dense that musket balls didn't splinter them, they simply lodged in the timbers. Cannonballs, instead of shattering the planking, often bounced off. Spanish records describe Manila galleons taking direct cannon hits that would have shattered a European-built ship and barely showing damage. The wood itself was a defensive system. Then there was the cargo concealment. Galleons routinely sailed with hidden compartments, false floors in the captain's cabin, sealed voids in the ballast, hollowed-out beams. Pirates who took galleons sometimes found, weeks later, that the real treasure had never been in the official cargo hold at all. It had been built into the ship itself. The galleons also carried religious infrastructure that wasn't just decoration. Statues of the Virgin and various saints were nailed to the masts and bulkheads, blessed by priests in elaborate ceremonies before each voyage. Crew morale, in an age where every sailor genuinely believed in divine protection, was a tactical resource. A galleon that prayed well was a galleon that fought better. The loading process itself was a small civil war. The official Casa de Contratación in Seville controlled what could legally be loaded, but every captain, every merchant, every officer smuggled. Cargo manifests were forged. Bribes were paid. Goods were hidden in passengers' personal chests. By some estimates, up to a third of the cargo on a typical Manila galleon was technically illegal contraband. The Spanish crown knew. They mostly looked the other way, because cracking down would have collapsed the entire trade. The escort doctrine was sophisticated. Manila galleons usually sailed alone because the Pacific was too vast and the route too specific for fleet sailing. But the Caribbean treasure fleets sailed in tight formations of 20 to 50 ships. The largest galleons sailed in the center. Smaller galleons and warships formed the outer ring. Naos and merchant vessels were tucked inside. Pirates who attacked these fleets had to first defeat or evade the outer ring. Almost no one ever managed it. Piat Haynes' capture at Matanzas Bay in 1628 happened only because the Spanish fleet panicked and ran aground. In open water, with formation intact, the fleet was nearly invincible. The galleon, in other words, wasn't just a ship. She was a system, a floating, self-defending, self-supplying, self-sanctifying institution that combined military, commercial, religious, and bureaucratic functions into a single wooden hull. Capturing one wasn't just hard because of the guns. It was hard because you were attacking an entire civilization compressed into a single moving target. Part 9. There's a layer to the galleon's story that goes beyond cannons and cargo, and it's the layer that makes her unforgettable. The galleon was a symbol so powerful that even 3 centuries after the last one sailed, the image of her still defines how the world pictures the age of empires. When a Spanish galleon entered a harbor anywhere in the world, she was not just delivering goods. She was making a statement. She was the Spanish crown made physical. The carved saints on her stern, the painted flags streaming from her masts, the rows of cannons in her sides, the priests on her decks, all of it broadcast the same message. The empire is here. The empire is rich. The empire is watching. In Manila, the arrival of the annual galleon from Acapulco was the central event of the year. The entire economy of the colony depended on her cargo. Markets shut down. Bells rang in every church. Crowds gathered on the harbor to watch her drop anchor. In Acapulco, the arrival of the eastbound galleon from Manila was the same. A fair was held that lasted weeks. Merchants traveled from across New Spain to bid on her cargo. The city's entire annual income was tied to her schedule. In Seville, The arrival of the treasure fleet from the Caribbean was even more dramatic. The river Guadalquivir would fill with people. The cathedral would hold Thanksgiving masses. The crown would calculate, almost instantly, how much it could borrow against the silver in those holds. Wars were funded by these arrivals. Marriages between royal houses were negotiated around them. The fate of Europe rose and fell with the schedule of the treasure fleets. This is why capturing a galleon was about so much more than money. When Drake took the Cacafugo, the wealth was extraordinary, but the deeper damage was to Spanish prestige. When Piet Hein took the entire fleet at Matanzas, it nearly bankrupted the Spanish crown for that year. When Cavendish burned the Santa Ana, he wasn't just stealing cargo. He was sending a message that the Pacific, supposedly a Spanish lake, was no longer safe. The galleon was empire as theater, and every pirate, every privateer, every rival admiral who hunted one understood that. They weren't just attacking a ship. They were attacking the idea that Spain was invincible. And every successful capture, no matter how rare, chipped away at that idea until, eventually, the whole thing came apart. Part 10. The end of the galleon didn't come the way you might expect. It wasn't pirates. It wasn't storms. It wasn't a single decisive defeat. The galleon was killed by something far quieter, far slower, and far harder to fight: economics. By the mid-18th century, the Spanish economy was suffocating on its own silver. 2 centuries of New World mining had flooded Europe with so much precious metal that the value of silver had collapsed. The wealth that had once made Spain the most powerful nation in Europe was now barely covering the empire's debts. The Bourbon kings who took the Spanish throne after 1700 began reforming the trade system. The monopoly fleets were weakened. Independent merchant vessels were allowed to sail. The grand convoys of galleons, once the lifeblood of the empire, became economically unjustifiable. At the same time, ship design was leaving the galleon behind. The British and French had perfected the ship of the line, a dedicated warship far more powerful than any galleon afloat. They had also perfected the frigate, faster and more efficient than any galleon for patrol and convoy work. And the East Indiamen of the English and Dutch companies had taken over much of the global cargo trade. The galleon's combined warship-cargo ship role no longer made sense in a world that specialized. The Caribbean treasure fleet stopped sailing in their classic form by the 1730s. The Manila galleon held out longer, mostly out of tradition and bureaucratic inertia, but by the early 1800s even she was finished. The last Manila galleon, the Magallanes, made her final voyage in 1815. After 250 years of unbroken service, the longest commercial shipping route in history was simply discontinued. There was no battle, no farewell. The ship just stopped sailing, and with her ended an entire age of the world. The galleon's legacy is everywhere if you know how to look. The cathedrals of Mexico City and Manila were built with her silver. The mission churches of California were funded by her trade. The porcelain in European royal collections came from her holds. The cinnamon and pepper in 18th century kitchens crossed the Pacific in her cargo. The very idea of globalization, of goods flowing continuously between continents, began with her roots. But there's a deeper legacy, and it's the one that matters most. The galleon teaches us that size and grandeur can become their own prison. She was the largest, richest, most heavily defended ship of her age, and precisely because of that, she became the most desired target on the planet. Her wealth attracted her destroyers. Her slowness made her vulnerable. Her magnificence made her famous. Every advantage she had was also a liability. She was empire in wooden form, magnificent, slow, self-important, endlessly hunted, and eventually, inevitably, replaced by something leaner and meaner that didn't carry the weight of being symbolic. The next time you see a movie or a painting of a pirate attacking a great Spanish galleon, watch carefully. The romance is real, but the truth is heavier. That ship in the painting wasn't just carrying treasure. She was carrying a civilization, and the pirates circling her weren't just thieves. They were the future, biting at the past, slowly tearing it down one chase at a time. Picture that Acapulco harbor again, the shadow on the docks, the carved saints on the stern, the smell of tar and gold dust, a floating fortress preparing to sail into 9,000 miles of empty ocean. Picture her as she was, magnificent, doomed, and absolutely unrepeatable. She was a galleon, and for 2.5 centuries, every pirate in the world dreamed of taking her down. Most of them died still dreaming. If you want to see how Blackbeard turned a captured slave ship into the most feared warship in the Caribbean, that video is on screen now. Subscribe for more stories from the Age of Sail.